The world is really weird right now. There's a lot of really weird things going on, and a lot of weird stuff. Hearing about a lot of weird things, but this kind of isn't old news. You want to know why? Because the world's been doing weird things since it was created. You want to see an example? Every civilization around the world has a myth about the world flooding. Isn't that kind of weird? They all just copy each other. Like, I know they do it with a bunch of different examples, but
No, Rob, we're not going over this. We're not talking about it. I really hate that guy. Why did I hire him?
what was I doing? Oh yeah, so flood myths, also more formally known as the Great Deluge myths. Essentially, people in all of these different places and more all believe that there was a worldwide catastrophic flood that killed almost everyone on the planet.
But wait, how can they all be essentially the same story if they're from all over the place and they all have different details?
Well, it's all the same plot. It's like a meme format, but for mythology. So yeah, so humans are doing their thing, making civilization, getting really populated. They're really populating the earth. They're doing what the gods want. They're doing really well, and then they get really sinful. And then when they get really sinful, any of the gods can get really mad at them, and they'll raise the sea level. They filling up the sink, and they're doing the dishes, and they're cleaning us off the plate. Humans are special though. We're built to maintain and endure and persevere. So a flood isn't gonna get rid of all of us. Some of us survive. We're like the tomato stain on your plastic Tupperware. You got rid of most of the tomato sauce, but a few of us still linger. In the end of every story, some small population of humans survive and go on to repopulate the earth. How they do this is different in every single story. For this, we need to consult the Wheel of Survival! Okay, Wheel of Survival. Which method did our pesky human contestants use today? Our contestant is a little boat. Little boat. The idea with this is instead of using a massive ark, one giant boat to save everyone, you use a bunch of small little boats for everyone to save themselves on. So for today's contestant, we're going to use the Gumaj tribe, which are a native Aboriginal people of Australia, specifically the northernmost tip of the Northern Territory of Australia. And so I'm not going to get into the backstory. It's linked below. But um, what happens in this story is a woman cries and rain falls heavily for several weeks. The world's flooded. How do we escape? How are we going to survive? We're going to make some rafts. We're going to rip the bark off the trees and we're going to make some little bark rafts. We're all going to float out to the sea. Now that we're done with that, we still don't know why there's a great deluge myth. Why all these different civilizations have the same style of myth. It can't be fake, considering how many cultures have it and how widespread it is. It can't all be made up. There are two main schools of thought for explaining this. One is that there were scattered events. There's a bunch of different events that happened to a bunch of different civilizations, all at different times, but they all caused floods and thus um, all remembered as such. The other one is that there's this one great flood, and it affected nearly every civilization, and that they all remember it as such. There are actually a lot of examples of this. The first example being that many early civilizations first formed on the banks of rivers, thus being the river valley civilizations. And each of those river valley civilizations has a flood myth based off the flooding of those rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates in Iraq, the Nile in Egypt, the Yellow River in China, the Ganges River in India and Bangladesh, and even more, all have their own flood myths, and at least for those civilizations, it is more likely based on slightly irregular or slightly more voluminous flood than in regular years, just some sort of weather anomaly. There are many civilizations, however, that popped up not by the riverbanks, and thus there needs to be an explanation for those too. which there actually is. For the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, and really any civilization that was located on the Mediterranean Sea would have experienced the eruption of Thera. Thera, which is now the island of Santorini, was an ancient volcanic island that erupted, and the landslide from from essentially the island falling into the sea. This landslide would have formed a massive tsunami that would have clear cut any civilization living on the coast of the Mediterranean. This actually happened in the Indian Ocean too, a little west of Madagascar, approximately on the mid-Indian Ocean ridge. A meteor actually hit around 12,000 years ago, and this can be seen with the Berkel crater. And any civilization on the Indian Ocean would have felt this. As far from Madagascar and Arabia, all the way to India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and Western Australia. However, there are not enough isolated events for this theory to just hold by itself. This leads to the second viewpoint, being that there is a common event that everyone experienced. An example of this is people would dig into mountains, or they just see the faces of mountains, and they'd see fossilized seashells in them. Where would those fossilized seashells come from? For them, they just thought the seas were that high before. But we know that from plate tectonics. Wait, what are plate tectonics? Yeah, plate tectonics. Let me not get ahead of myself. Okay, plate tectonics, really quick. Okay, you got this little pool. Got this little pool, and you got all these little rafts in it. Some of the rafts are kind of tall. Some of the rafts are kind of really flat. Some of the rafts that are really tall also go under the water a little bit towards the edges. Okay, remember that detail. Okay. Second, these rafts are now continents, and now the water's lava. So now you got all these continents floating on lava. In this case, would be magma, whatever, pretty similar. The flat ones, these are seabeds. The taller ones, these are continents. Seabeds heavier and also just flatter, so it can sink under the continent rafts. Continent raft goes up. Part of that continent raft that was under the water before also goes up. That's an ancient seabed that's now a mountain. This explanation also faces the same problem with the river valley civilization example, as not every civilization lives by mountains. Thus, there has to be some sort of event that caused flooding across the globe. This flooding being the collapse of Lake Agassiz. Lake Agassiz may be the largest body of fresh water that has ever existed on Earth. Lake Agassiz is a massive interglacial lake that sat on top of the North American continent around 13,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago. It spanned around most of Canada and some of Minnesota. This lake has a larger surface area than the Caspian Sea and nearly 3 times the volume, the Caspian Sea being the current largest landlocked body of water. So when Lake Agassiz eventually did collapse, and even before, Lake Agassiz had overfilled many a times from the melting glacier water, and thus those lines shown below are actually the drain channels. These are the rivers that the water from Lake Agassiz would take to the ocean. And if you were a person living here, this would have been terrifying. This would look like the world is flooding. Literally, you'd be seeing it right before your eyes. This amount of water was actually so large that it also disrupted deep ocean currents, which would have affected the weather severely. All of this would look like the work of gods if you didn't have any science, if you didn't have any modern technology and a lot of research to figure this out, then the only logical explanation would be divine intervention. So what's the conclusion? It's a little bit of everything. It's specific to location. Some of these events wouldn't have affected some cultures as much as others. For example, Lake Agassiz definitely affected everyone, but for an example, it didn't affect the river valley civilizations as much as maybe the Black Sea civilizations or the civilizations around the Mediterranean Sea. But that's just another day in the office for us humans. We push through the weird stuff. A lot of weird things happen, we just push through it, and it's just another day. Thanks for watching.